If you've come to listen to a quiet story, one meant to settle your thoughts and guide you softly towards sleep, then sit close, friend. Let me tell you, in a slow and gentle voice, how we, the simple people of the Middle Ages, survived the nights when winter felt almost alive, cold enough to test a person's spirit, and quiet enough to make you hear your own heartbeat echo in your ears. You see, when folks today imagine the medieval world, they picture knights on horseback, kings in warm halls, and ladies wrapped in velvet cloaks. But the truth is much plainer. Most of us were peasants' field hands, shepherds, carpenters, and women who kept the home and the fire. And our winters? They were nothing like the gentle snowfall you know. They were long, they were deep, they were cruel to the bone. And so, if you're wondering how we survived the coldest nights, let me paint it for you slowly, like a candle burning low. It usually began in late autumn, when the last of the leaves had fallen from the oak trees. You could feel the weather change in the wind. The air grew sharp and dry like broken glass. The sunlight weakened day by day, until the shadows stretched longer than the afternoon itself. By then, everyone knew what was coming. The first thing we did was seal the home. You must understand, our houses weren't tight like your buildings today. The walls were wattle and daub-woven sticks covered in mud and straw. The roof was thatch. The wind knew every crack and gap. It liked to slide under the door like a cat we hadn't invited. So we stuffed the cracks with moss-thick, dry clumps we would gather from the forest days before the frost. We hammered spare bits of cloth into the edges of the windows. Even then, the home sighed in the cold, like a living creature feeling the season settle over it. Inside, we had one source of warmth, the hearth. Not a big fireplace, no, just a square stone pit in the middle of the house. The smoke curled up through a hole in the roof, and sometimes the wind pushed it back down into our faces. But that was the price we paid. If the fire died, we felt it immediately. The cold would wrap around our ankles like icy hands, creeping up slowly until the whole room felt stiff. And so, the rule was simple. Never let the fire die at night. Someone in the family always stayed half awake, usually the eldest, or one of the older children. They would stir the embers every hour or so, feeding it with thin twigs or a handful of dry straw. Anything thicker we saved for daylight, when the fire was strong enough to burn it without wasting time or heat. But fire alone wasn't enough. No matter how hot the flames burned, the nights outside the walls were monstrous. I remember one winter, I must have been 13. It came down so suddenly even the village dogs cried. The frost crept up the sides of our house like white veins. Water buckets froze solid. The animals in the barn huddled so close to each other that we heard their trembling through the walls. So we used another rule too. We slept together, all of us, parents, children, even a guest if one happened to be travelling through. Not for comfort, but for survival. We had something called a family bed. Not really a bed, but a raised wooden platform with layers of straw under wool blankets. The youngest slept in the middle, where it was warmest. The eldest slept on the edges, guarding everyone else from the cold. It wasn't glamorous, but on the harshest nights, it felt like being inside a warm animal, breathing together, sharing heat. If you think that sounds strange, let me tell you, even the animals slept close. Chickens were often brought inside during the coldest nights, not because we liked the noise, but because they froze if left in the coop. A handful of birds tucked under a bench or perched on a wooden beam meant fresh eggs come spring. We weren't sentimental, we were practical. And the cows, their breath alone warmed the barn enough to keep the other animals alive. Many a peasant would step into the cowshed just to thaw their hands. The warm smell of hay and cattle, that was the scent of survival. Food played its role too. Before nightfall, we often ate something hot, pottage bubbling in a pot, made from turnips, cabbage, onions and barley if we were lucky. Not a feast, but warmth from the inside could mean the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Sometimes when the cold was truly vicious, we drank warm ale or a weak cider. Children were given warmed milk with herb sage or thyme to help them sleep deeply. We believed herbs carried heat, and maybe they did, or maybe we only imagined it. But imagination can be a kind of fire as well. But perhaps the hardest challenge of all was the dark. You see, winter nights were not like nights today, where streetlights glow and the hum of distant cars keeps you company. Our nights were dense, total. You could stretch your hand in front of your face and see nothing but a black so thick it felt like velvet. Even the moon sometimes hid behind clouds for days, leaving the village swallowed in a silence that pressed against the door like a visitor wanting to come in. We told ourselves stories to ease the fear-quiet tales whispered by the fire. Tales of travellers, spirits, saints, and creatures who roamed the woods. Not to scare the children, but to remind them that fear was normal. Everyone felt it. Everyone lived with it. And when the wind howled, and it truly howled, like something alive scraping its claws against the sky, we huddled closer under the blankets. We breathed slowly. We waited. Because in the Middle Ages, winter was not an inconvenience. Winter was an enemy. Yet somehow we survived. Night after night. Year after year. Maybe because we were strong, or maybe because we had no other choice. But that is the beginning of the story. How we peasants prepared ourselves for the coldest nights of the year, and how the fire, the family, and the smallest bits of warmth kept us alive through the season, when even the trees seemed to shiver. If you stayed with me through the first part, then settle your shoulders, breathe a little softer, and let me guide you deeper into those long medieval winter nights. Those nights when frost didn't just linger outside, but crept into the very places we thought were safe. Because sooner or later, in every winter, no matter how well we prepared, the cold always found a way in. You must remember, a peasant's home was alive in its own way. The wood swelled and shrank with the weather, the thatch whispered in the wind, and the walls made from mud, straw and hope sometimes cracked during frost. That was simply life. But there were nights when the cold felt like an intruder, something with weight and presence. And the first sign of it was always the same, the quiet. Not a peaceful quiet, not the sort that makes you relax. No, this was the kind of quiet that felt expectant, heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. I remember one night in particular, clearer than I remember most things. I must have been around 15 winters old enough to help carry firewood, young enough to think I knew everything about cold. My mother told me to watch the hearth as she and my father checked the barn before sleep. "Don't let the embers die," she whispered, as if the dark might hear her. "I won't," I promised, though I was already half drowsy. The fire was glowing steady then, orange, warm, alive. I leaned close, letting my face soak in the heat. Outside, the wind scratched along the walls, but inside everything was still, calm. But then something changed. The air thinned somehow. The warmth felt fragile, like a soap bubble stretched too far. Even the animals, our chickens, the dog curled by the door, seemed to sense it. The hairs on my arms rose, and for reasons I didn't understand, I felt like sitting up straighter. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice. A crystalline crackle. Not from outside, but from inside, the kind of sound frost makes when it spreads across glass. Only we had no glass in our home, no windows at all. The sound came from the walls. I crawled toward them on my hands and knees, holding a small ember lamp to see better. And yes, there it was. Thin, pale lines of ice forming across the mud walls like white spiderwebs creeping outward. Slowly, deliberately. It was the first time I'd seen frost grow inside. And the fire, it answered. It popped and spat sparks, as if waking up to defend itself. The warmth wavered, retreating just a bit. And when warmth retreats, cold surges. When my parents returned, they saw the walls and sighed, not in fear, but in resignation. "The frost is visiting tonight," my father said. "We'll endure." It was a common phrase among peasants. The frost is visiting. We treated the cold like a presence, something almost intelligent. Not a spirit exactly, but a force with intention, with mood. Perhaps that sounds foolish to you now, but when you live in a home where frost grows in the corners, a little superstition feels like armour. That night we went to extreme measures to stay warm. We took the iron pot off its hook and filled it with stones warmed in the fire. Hot stones hold heat better than anything else we owned. We wrapped them in cloth and placed them at the foot of the sleeping platform, letting the warmth rise up through the straw. We shut the shutters tight, even though they barely kept wind out, and placed the thickest wool we owned along the doorframe. The dog was lifted. Yes, lifted onto the bed near the edge. A warm dog was better than another blanket, and every bit of heat mattered. My younger sister, no older than 7, curled up so tightly that she resembled a little hedgehog. She fell asleep first, tucked in between all of us like a glowing coal. Her breath puffed into the cold air like little clouds. But even with all this, the air inside the home still felt brittle. When cold settles this deep, it has a way of silencing even the night creatures. No owls, no foxes, no crunch of footsteps outside. Just the faint crackling, the quiet trembling, a slow spread of frost across the walls. My father stayed awake longer than any of us. I could hear his breathing steady, patient as he fed the fire stick by stick. He didn't dare add too much wood at once, that would waste fuel. The well-tended fire was like a living creature that needed careful feeding. Small, regular, constant. Sometime after midnight, though we didn't truly tell time back then, I woke to a sensation I'll never forget. My breath hung in the air like smoke, in my own home. Little white puffs drifting upward from my mouth in the darkness, each one vanishing just a moment after it appeared. You might think that meant danger, but no, this was simply winter. Real winter. A winter that could eat the warmth right out of your chest if you let it. I shifted closer to the middle of the bed, where my mother and sister slept. Their bodies were warm, and the gentle rise and fall of their breathing felt like a lullaby. My father lay behind me, keeping the outer edge warm with his thick wool tunic. I felt his arm shift as he stood again and went back to the hearth. He was checking on the embers for the 100th time. You see, the biggest fear was not frost, not the cold on the walls, not the frozen buckets or trembling animals. The biggest fear was waking up to a dead fire. If the fire died during a night like this, it was terrible work to bring it back. Flints could misfire, tinder could fail. And if too much time passed, well, a home without heat in weather like that was not a safe home. So the adults stayed vigilant, the children dreamed, the wind prowled outside, and the frost well, it continued its silent creeping along the walls, a reminder that nature was always stronger than us, and that survival came down to a simple truth. We endured together, or not at all. In the morning, when dawn finally arrived as a pale smear of light behind the clouds, I saw something beautiful. The frost that had crawled across the walls during the night had formed delicate patterns, like feathers, or branches, or tiny frozen rivers. My mother ran her fingers across them, careful not to knock them loose. Even the cold has an artist's hand, she murmured, and then she smiled, soft and tired. We had survived another night, and in the Middle Ages, that meant everything. You might think the worst of medieval winter was the evenings, those early sunsets, the long stretches of darkness, the cold pressing on the door like some hungry beast. But no, the hardest time, truly, was the few hours just before dawn. The time when the night had wrung every ounce of warmth out of the world, and even the fire was beginning to tire. That was when the cold felt personal. I remember waking up many winter mornings this way. My nose numb, my fingers curled involuntarily, my breath coming out in soft white clouds that drifted up to the roof beams. The kind of chill that wasn't content to sit on your skin, it wanted your bones. And yet, strangely, these hours were the quietest of all. No wind, no animal sounds, no voices. Just a stillness so deep it felt like the world itself was asleep. My father used to say, "This is the hour when even the cold must gather strength." And he wasn't wrong. Once the sun rose, if it rose at all, the frost retreated a little. But before sunrise, that was its reign. On one particular morning, I woke before my family. It must have been from a dream, though the details slipped from my mind like snow off a roof. I blinked into the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the faint orange glow of a weakening hearth. The fire had burned low during the night. Not dangerously low, but low enough to worry a farmer. The logs had collapsed inward, leaving a bed of glowing coals that pulsed like a giant's heartbeat. Slow, steady, too faint to keep the room warm. I watched the embers for a moment, feeling the cold tighten around my ankles like invisible hands. Then I slid off the sleeping platform, trying not to wake anyone. The floorboards stung my feet immediately. We never walked barefoot in winter, but that morning my wool socks had slipped off during sleep. I winced and tiptoed to the hearth. The air there was warmer but still weak like a sigh instead of a true breath. I reached toward the fire basket, searching for smaller sticks. You never put heavy logs on a dying fire. You start with twigs, slivers of wood, sometimes even dry straw if you're desperate. Anything thin enough to catch quickly, yet steady enough to encourage the coals. I placed them gently onto the reddest part of the ember bed. For a moment nothing happened. Then, a tiny flicker, a spark, a curl of yellow flame. Not enough to chase away the cold, but enough to give me hope. Behind me I heard a rustle. My father shifted on the bed, probably sensing the chill even in his sleep, but he didn't wake. He trusted me with this task. That thought alone made my chest warm despite the cold. I added a few more sticks. The fire answered with a soft crackle, a delicate, encouraging sound that echoed quietly in the still room. Light grew, shadows danced on the walls, and the frost patterns began to shimmer where the dim glow touched them. It was a small victory, but in winter every victory mattered. Once the fire was steady, I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat cross-legged on the floor. The dog, hearing me up, wandered over and pressed his head against my knee. His fur was warm near the skin but cold at the surface, like snow covering a live coal. I rested my hand on his head and listened. There's a kind of silence in winter that you rarely hear in modern life. It's not empty, not dead. It's like the world is breathing so slowly you can barely perceive it. You sit there long enough and it feels like you're part of it, just another creature waiting for dawn. Inside our little house, the silence was punctuated only by small things. The faint pop of sap cooking inside a burning twig. The soft murmur of my mother shifting in her sleep. The steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. The crackle of frost tightening on the outside walls. The occasional creak of the roof complaining under the weight of snow. All of that blended together like a winter lullaby. I didn't know it then, but these mornings would become some of my most treasured memories. Because when you grow up, you learn that winter is not only hardship, it is togetherness, quiet, and a kind of peace that only comes when you have nothing but family, fire, and the hope of sunrise. A while later, my mother woke. She always did before anyone else. Her instincts were sharper than the cold. She sat up, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and came to kneel beside me, touching the fire grate lightly. "You kept it alive," she whispered, her voice warm even though the air wasn't. "Good lad." I felt a swell of pride, bigger than you might think, because in a medieval village this wasn't just a chore, it was survival. She gently placed a heavier log onto the growing flames. The fire licked at it eagerly. Heat bloomed outward in slow expanding waves, and the frost on the nearest section of wall began to melt, droplets forming like tiny tears. My mother sighed in relief, and I did too. When the first light of dawn finally appeared, just the faintest grey pushing back at the night, we prepared to face the cold outside. Dawn light in winter wasn't warm or golden. It was pale, cold, reluctant, like someone being forced out of bed much too early. But to us, it meant the worst part of the day was over, because once the sun appeared, even weakly, the world softened a little. My father rose, stretched, and brushed frost from his beard. My sister burrowed deeper into the blankets until my mother coaxed her awake. The dog trotted to the door, tail wagging, eager despite the cold. And me? I stood by the fire, warming my hands, feeling the numbness retreat from my fingertips. In those early morning moments, before the day's chores began, there was a sense of calm that no storm could take from us. A quiet triumph, a shared breath. If you've ever woken up on a cold morning with nothing but the echo of your stomach to greet you, then you understand a small piece of medieval life. But only a small one. Because for us, hunger wasn't a quick inconvenience you solved by walking to a kitchen. No, you lived with hunger the way you live with weather. You noticed it. You accepted it. You worked around it. And in the deepest part of winter, it became something like a neighbour. Unwelcome, persistent, but always there. Once the fire had grown strong enough to take the bite out of the air, my mother would turn to the morning's ritual, deciding what we could spare for breakfast. It wasn't a matter of what we wanted, but what we could allow ourselves. Most mornings that meant pottage. You might imagine pottage as a kind of simple soup, and you'd be right. But what made it truly medieval was that the pot never really emptied. You didn't start pottage from scratch, you added to it. Whatever scraps you had, a handful of oats, a piece of barley, maybe some dried peas, if you were lucky, very lucky, a strip of salted meat. In winter, though, luck was a rare visitor, so our pottage looked the same most days. Thick, greyish, steaming softly like a tired old horse. But to us, the sight of steam alone was a gift. It meant warmth. It meant energy for the day. It meant survival. I remember one morning in particular, not because anything grand happened, but because it was so painfully ordinary that it etched itself into my memory. My mother leaned over the pot, stirring slowly. The wooden spoon knocked gently against the sides. A soft, wet sound, comforting in its own quiet way. She tasted it, frowned slightly, then added the last pinch of dried herbs from a cloth pouch. She always saved herbs for winter. They made thin food feel fuller, warmer, almost like a kind of magic. "Hand me the oats," she said softly, and I passed the small bowl to her. As she poured them in, I realised the bowl was nearly empty. "Is that all?" I asked. She paused, looking at the pottery bowl as if hoping more oats might appear. Then she nodded. "It will do." Her voice wasn't worried or frightened, just steady. Winter teaches you not to panic. Panic wastes energy, and energy is the rarest thing of all. My father stepped back into the house after checking the animals. His beard was stiff with frost, tiny white crystals clinging to the hairs like decorations. He shut the door behind him quickly, keeping as much heat inside as possible. "The sheep are restless," he said. "Cold night." My mother nodded. Everything was cold last night. He sat beside the hearth, warming his hands. The dog settled next to him. Steam rose from my father's boots as the leather thawed. "You were up early," he said, glancing at me. "I didn't want the fire to die," I answered. He gave me a slow nod, the kind that said more than words. In our world, tending the fire was an act of responsibility, a sign you were beginning to understand what survival requires, a sign you were becoming someone the family could rely on. When the pottage was ready, we gathered around the pot the way some families gather around a table today. There was no ceremony, just the shared understanding that warm food was a blessing. My mother ladled small portions into wooden bowls, not full bowls, never full in winter, just enough to warm your stomach, soften your breath, and nudge away the sharpest edge of hunger. I remember lifting the bowl to my lips and inhaling the steam. It smelled of oats, herbs, and the faint memory of vegetables we had long since eaten. The broth wasn't rich, but it was warm, and warmth mattered more than flavour. I took the first slow sip. The way the heat spread down my throat felt almost like waking up a second time. My sister, still wrapped in a blanket, ate with both hands around her bowl to keep her fingers warm. She didn't speak. None of us did. Not out of sadness or gloom. We simply didn't waste energy on unnecessary words in winter mornings. Silence was practical. Silence was peaceful. Silence meant you were listening to the fire, to the house, to your own heartbeat. After eating, we prepared for the day. And by prepared, I mean we layered ourselves with every scrap of warmth we owned. 2 tunics if you had them, a wool cloak, layers of linen, and boots stuffed with straw. The straw is something people today often forget. You might laugh at the idea, but straw is a winter gift. Dry, soft, insulating. It keeps the cold from creeping through the soles of your boots and into your bones. My father stuffed mine personally that morning, pushing straw into the toe so firmly that my feet felt like they were wearing little nests. "There," he said, "you'll last longer outside today." Outside. The word hung in the air like a warning, because no matter how warm the house was, winter waited for you the moment you stepped past the threshold. Before leaving, my father did something he always did on the coldest mornings, something small but deeply human. He reached out and placed his hand over the fire for a moment, just long enough for heat to sink into his skin, and then he touched each of us lightly on the shoulder. It was an old habit of his, a kind of silent blessing, warmth shared before parting ways for the day. "Keep moving," he told me. "Movement keeps you living." I nodded, clutching my cloak close. Movement, heat, fire. These were the rules of winter life. And then came that moment every medieval family knows, when the door opens, when the warm air escapes, when the cold rushes in like a wave, when your breath catches, your spine stiffens, your eyes water. We stepped outside. The world was white and silent, as if carved from ice. Fields slept under a heavy blanket of snow. Trees stood like skeletons, and our footprints from yesterday had frozen into hard ridges. My father started toward the barn. My mother went to check the stored food. My sister carried scraps for the chickens, and I followed my father, knowing the animals needed tending before anything else. Behind us, the house exhaled a faint trail of smoke from the chimney, our only signal of life in a world frozen solid. And as strange as it may sound, that faint ribbon of smoke curling into the cold morning air was the most comforting sight of all. It meant we were still here, still warm, still surviving. Some people today imagine a medieval barn as a cold, hollow wooden box, dark, drafty and miserable. And sure, ours wasn't anything like a cosy cottage. But for us peasants, the barn was something close to a winter refuge. Not for sleeping, no, but for working, thinking, warming your hands on living breath. Because animals, even the simplest ones, give off heat. And when the world outside froze itself into silence, the barn breathed. Literally breathed. You could hear it. You could feel it. A slow, warm exhale that came from cows, sheep, goats, and the thick layers of straw that covered the ground. If you spent long enough in that kind of warmth, you almost forgot it was winter. Almost. The morning I'm telling you about, the one with the thin pottage and the stiff frost, began in the barn as most winter days did. My father pushed the door open, and the smell hit us instantly. Not unpleasant, just strong. The mix of hay, old wool, damp wood and animal musk. The smell of survival. Inside, the air was warmer than the cold morning behind us. Not warm by any modern measure, of course, but enough that your face didn't sting and your breath didn't crystallise the moment it left your lips. The cows were shifting, the sheep bleating softly, the goat chewing at a splinter in the stall wall, as if it had been waiting all night for someone to notice. My father let out a satisfied hum. Still alive, he said, which in winter was an entire category of blessing. We started with the sheep. Their wool wasn't just useful, it was life. Clothes, blankets, even the stuffing for boots. Sheep are kind animals, soft-spoken, but in winter they felt fragile. You had to watch them closely. Hunger and cold don't treat sheep kindly. I stepped into the pen, letting my breath warm my hands. The sheep nosed at my cloak, searching for grain. Their wool had gathered bits of frost around the outer layers, making them look like they were sprinkled with stars. I brushed some snow from the smallest 1 shy ewe with the clever eyes. "You made it," I whispered to her. "Good girl." She leaned into my hand, and for a moment the world outside didn't matter. Next were the cows. Now cows are creatures of habit. They don't like changes. They don't like surprises. And winter is nothing but surprises. The cold puts them on edge. The lack of fresh grass frustrates them. But the biggest challenge is water ice forms quickly, and cows need to drink. My father always said, "A thirsty cow is 1 day away from trouble." So while he checked the roof beams and the feed stores, my job was to break the ice in the water trough. I took the old iron rod from the wall and tapped the ice. Crack, tap again, crack. A few more taps and the surface split apart, revealing dark, frigid water beneath. The cows moved closer immediately, their warm breath fogging the air. One of them nudged me gently, as if thanking me or demanding me to hurry, depending on her mood. I stepped back and let them drink. It was then that my father spoke, his voice low but steady. "This winter is biting harder than last year." I nodded. You could feel it in the way the frost clung to the barn walls, in how quickly the water froze again, in how even the animals seemed slower, more careful with their movements. "Will we have enough feed?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the bales of hay stacked in the corner. Each bale represented hours of summer labour, cutting, turning, drying, storing, if you misjudged the amount you paid for it in winter. He pressed his hand into one bale, then stepped back and sighed. "If we ration carefully," he said, "if we stretch it, if the storms stay away." In other words, maybe. And maybe was something you learn to live with. We spent the next hour mucking the stalls, scooping old straw, replacing it with fresh layers. This wasn't just for cleanliness. A thick bed of straw is insulation. Animals, like people, need something between them and the cold earth. Fresh straw also traps body heat, turning a freezing barn into something almost hospitable. The rhythm of the work was strangely soothing. Scoop, lift, scatter, smooth with your hands. My father used to say winter was the season of simple tasks. Nothing fancy, nothing ambitious. Just the slow, steady work of keeping life moving forward 1 day at a time. After the stalls were cleaned, we turned to repairs. Winter doesn't wait for good weather to break things. A loose hinge on the barn door, a cracked beam, a frayed rope, a draft where there shouldn't be one. We fixed everything we could with what little we had, wood scraps, iron nails saved from old tools. rope braided from worn-out fibres. Medieval life wasn't about buying new things, it was about making old things last. My father handed me a wooden peg. "Hold this steady," he said, and together we secured a loose board that had been rattling in the wind all night. The wind might have been strong, but we were stubborn. When we finished, we sat on a bale of hay for a moment, catching our breath. The animals were calmer now, their morning routines complete. The barn was warmer, smoother, quieter, and for a little while that barn felt like the safest place in the world. My father broke the silence. "You know," he said, "some folks think winter is our enemy." He paused, running a hand through his beard. "But winter's just a teacher. Hard lessons, aye, but lessons all the same." I tilted my head. "What does it teach?" He smiled, not in a cheerful way, but in a knowing one. That you can endure more than you think. That warmth is precious. That a little food shared is better than a feast alone. That life doesn't need comfort to be full. I didn't understand all of that at the time, but I remembered it, and I grew into it. When it was finally time to leave the barn, we hesitated for a moment, enjoying the brief pocket of warmth. Outside waited the biting wind, the blinding snow, and the long list of chores that winter demanded. But as the saying went in our village, the cold won't wait, so neither can we. My father opened the door. A blade of wind sliced inside. The animals stirred. He pulled his hood up and stepped outside. I followed close behind, clutching my cloak against my chest. The barn door groaned shut behind us, and once again we stepped into the endless white silence of winter. Aye, sit closer to the fire, friend. This is the part of winter that folk from your time never truly grasp. The part where our own survival is tied so tightly to our animals that losing even one feels like losing a limb. I've spoken of cold nights and thin rye bread and draughty walls, but to live through winter in our village we must first keep them alive. The cows, the pigs, the sheep, the horses, the chickens, even the smallest barn cats that prowl for mice. Winter is not a fight we fight alone. It is a siege laid upon every creature under our roofs. You look surprised. Maybe you think the animals stay in warm stables with piles of hay, comfortable as princes. Ha! If only. Our barns are rough and draughty, built from warped timber that groans in the frost. A barn wall keeps out the wind's teeth, aye, but it cannot stop the cold itself. That cold creeps in through every gap and crack. It lives inside the wood. Still, even a draughty barn is warmer than the open night. So each evening, before darkness swallows the sky, all hands in the household help drive the animals inside. The cows come willingly enough. They know warmth as well as we do. Their breath steams in the air, and as they huddle together, the barn begins to fill with that heavy, familiar smell. Hay, manure, earth, and the faint sweetness of milk. To some folk from your time, I suppose it might stink, but to us it smells like life, like safety. The pigs now. Pigs are another story. Stubborn, loud, and proud of their stubbornness. If they don't feel like walking, they simply won't. You can shout, you can push, you can bribe them with scraps. Sometimes they move, sometimes they don't. But once inside, they burrow into the straw like fat children in a featherbed. Their body heat is powerful. We sometimes joke that pigs keep the barn warmer than the fire keeps our house. And the sheep, skittish things. Their wool keeps them alive better than it keeps us when we shear it come spring. They huddle and tremble when the wind rises, bleating softly like frightened children. A good shepherd knows each sheep by the sound of its voice. Me, I'm no shepherd, but I can still tell when one is missing. In winter, a missing sheep is a dead sheep unless you find it fast. Horses. They are proud beasts, but winter humbles even them. Their coats grow thick, coarse, wild, and their eyes seem older, wiser. A horse in summer is a creature of muscle and sunlight. A horse in winter is a survivor. We need them, for hauling wood, for grinding grain, for travel when travel is still possible. Losing a horse is a wound to the whole village. You see now why we worry. So each night, after the animals are in, we do another task, a quiet, slow one. We walk through the barn with lanterns, checking each creature with our hands. Not our eyes, our hands. Eyes lie in winter, hands do not. A cold ear, a shivering flank, a damp nose. These signs tell us who might not make it through the night. And then we check their water. Now here is a thing you might not know. A bucket of water turns to ice faster in a barn than outside it. Something about the stillness. So each morning and night we break the ice with a wooden mallet or the back of an axe. The animals sip quickly before it freezes again. If the cold is truly cruel, we heat water over the hearth and bring it out steaming in sturdy buckets. That warmth goes fast, a few minutes at most, but sometimes a few minutes is all a weak animal needs. Feeding them is another battle. Hay. Aye, you know what hay is, but you may not know how precious it becomes in January. Autumn's harvest determines winter's chances. If the summer was dry, or the hay rotted in the stack, or a windstorm scattered it across the fields before we brought it in, then winter becomes a gamble. Not whether we'll have enough hay. No. The gamble is who will eat less, the animals or the family. We try to keep the animals fed, for if they die in winter, we are poorer in spring. No milk, no wool, no ploughing, no manure for the fields. Killing them early for meat seems like an easy answer, but it is not. Meat lasts a while, but a cow alive lasts years. Still. Sometimes we must choose. I remember a winter when I was a boy, when hunger pressed on our family like a great hand. We had one cow, old and tired, and she stopped giving milk halfway through December. My brother cried when my father made the decision. Not loudly. No one cried loudly in those days, but tears still came. For us, that cow had been a friend of sorts. But friends do not survive winter for sentiment alone. I remember the sound of the axe in the cold air. I remember the silence afterward. That year the meat kept our bellies from going hollow, but come spring we had no cow, and buying a new one cost more than we'd earned the whole summer. Every choice in winter is paid for again in spring. But enough of that heaviness. Winter is cruel, aye, but it's also when we draw closest to the creatures we tend. Sometimes, when a calf or a lamb is born in the dead heart of winter, and it happens no matter how hard we try to keep the timing right, we bring the newborns inside, into the house, into the warmth, into the same room where we sleep. A tiny lamb bleating softly in the night can warm more than just the air. It warms the spirit too, and in return we feed it warm milk from a clay cup, wrap it in old linen, keep it by the hearth until its legs are strong. The children love those nights. Even the barn cats get a place by the fire when the snow comes down sideways. They earn their keep by hunting mice that chew through the grain sacks, and in winter their job is more important than ever. Let too many mice survive, and suddenly the animals have nothing to eat, and neither do we. A cat is not just a pet, it is a guardian of our food. My wife always laughed when she told the cats they were honorary members of the household, but in truth they almost are. And the chickens? The chickens are fools. They fear the snow like it's a demon. Step outside? Never. So they stay inside their coop all winter, complaining endlessly, soft clucks and angry squawks. They still lay eggs, fewer but still precious. A warm egg on a cold morning feels like a blessing pressed into your hand. Aye, surviving winter is not only about us. It is about all of us together, man, beast, and barn cat alike. So when I sit here now, close to the fire, with you listening so kindly, I think of how many winters I've survived only because our animals survived them too. Their warmth, their labour, their milk, their wool. We owe them more than we ever say aloud. That's how peasants survive the coldest nights, friend. We survive them together. Aye, friend. Lean in again. The fire's burning low, and this part of the tale, well, it's best told in the hush of night, when the flames settle into embers and the wind presses gently against the shutters. Winter isn't only cold, it isn't only hunger or hard work. Winter also has a way of testing a village, not just the bodies of those who live in it, but their patience, their courage, their hearts. Some nights make the bravest men feel small, and the smallest sound can stretch the nerves thin as a cobweb. If you ask me when winter is at its cruelest, I'll tell you without a moment's hesitation, just before dawn. Not midnight, no. Midnight has the dignity of darkness, a clear place for fear to hide. But the hours before dawn, those are the unsettling ones. Too dark to be morning, too late to still feel like night. A strange in-between time where the house is coldest, the animals restless, the children shivering even in their sleep. Most of those nights, we wake long before the sun, not because we want to, because something makes us. A groaning beam in the roof, a sudden clatter in the barn, the wind twisting strangely around the house like it's trying to speak. You may laugh, but when you've lived as we have, with only thin walls between you and the great biting world, you begin to hear meaning in sounds others call random. And then there are the wolves. Aye, wolves. You see them in your stories, sleek and handsome, noble even. But you've never heard their howls echoing across a frozen field, rolling over the snow like thunder slowed to a crawl. When wolves are hungry, truly hungry, the sound they make travels straight into your bones. You feel it there, vibrating inside the marrow. Don't misunderstand me. Wolves are not monsters. They're animals trying to live, same as us. But hunger makes sharp teeth desperate, and we peasants live with animals that wolves consider a feast. Some winter nights, when the wolves draw close, the barn animals sense them before we do. A cow shifts and snorts nervously. The sheep stamp their small hooves on the packed straw. Even the horse, proud creature though it is, tosses its head and paces. And then, somewhere out beyond the dark, the howling rises. Not loud at first, just a note carried on the wind, enough to make you stop mid-breath. My father always said the right thing to do was simple. Get up, take the lantern and go out there. Simple, aye, but not easy. Imagine stepping outside into bitter cold, your boots sinking deep into the snow, breath turning to fog before your face, the moon hanging dimly behind thin clouds, the barn looming ahead like some crouched beast, and somewhere in the dark, wolves watching with patient yellow eyes. You push the barn door open, and all the animals look at you with the same expression. Please, don't leave us alone. So you stay a while, lantern held high, listening to the night. Sometimes the wolves leave once they know you're awake. Sometimes they circle for hours, but we endure, one breath after another, because the creatures behind us depend on it. And that is one kind of winter fear. The loud kind, the sharp kind, the kind that feels like cold fingers pressed to the back of your neck. But there is another kind, a quiet kind, a kind that settles inside the walls of the house. For you see, winter keeps us indoors longer than folk were ever meant to stay. You live in a world of rooms and lights and warmth, but we share a single room, all of us, day after day, night after night. The children, the elders, the tired, the restless, the good-tempered, the ill-tempered, all trapped together by snow and darkness. Most of the year, we escape to the fields, the forest, the river, the sky. But winter teaches patience, or breaks it. Some days, even the sound of someone breathing too loudly can spark argument, or the way someone stirs the pot, or the way someone walks across the floor, trifles, foolish things. But when the cold presses in from the outside and boredom presses in from the inside, tempers thin like ice on a pond. My mother had a saying, winter makes saints into sinners and sinners into lessons. She wasn't wrong. The trick, she always said, was to find small comforts. A story told quietly, a song hummed under your breath, mending a cloak, polishing a tool, teaching a child how to carve a spoon. It is these little tasks, little gentlenesses that keep a family from falling apart when the world outside goes silent. And silence. That is another thing you modern folk do not understand. Silence today is never truly silent for you. There is always some hum, some buzz, some machine, some light. But in our winters, when snow covered the world thick as a blanket, silence became a presence of its own, heavy, endless. A silence so deep that even your heartbeat felt loud. I remember one morning, or perhaps it was still night, when I stepped outside to check the barn. The world had been covered by a fresh, thick fall of snow. No tracks, no wind. The air so still that when I stopped walking I could hear the sound of the snow settling upon itself. Imagine that. Hearing snow move. Sometimes silence can frighten a man more deeply than wolves ever could. But winter is not only fear. No. It is also the season of courage. Strange, quiet courage. The kind that comes not from swinging a sword or shouting a challenge, but from doing the same small necessary things every single day, even when your hands shake from cold and your stomach aches from hunger. Getting out of bed before dawn to break the ice in the animals' troughs. That is courage. Carrying firewood through knee-deep snow. Courage. Keeping peace in a crowded home. Courage. Staying awake in the barn when wolves prowl. Courage. Facing another long day when the last one nearly broke you. Courage. It is a slow, stubborn kind of bravery. The kind peasants know best. Now, as I sit here telling you these things, with the fire crackling low and the night wrapped gently around us, I find myself thinking how strange it is that we survived winters like that. that whole villages did. Perhaps we were tougher, or perhaps we simply had no other choice. But if you ask me, I think the truth is simpler. We survived because we had each other. A village is like a fire. So long as someone is willing to add one more stick of wood, just one more, the flame keeps burning. And, speaking of flames, ours here is burning rather low, isn't it? Let me poke it a bit. There, better. Ah, there you are, friend. Sit close again. The fire's glow suits this next part well, for it is one of the heavier chapters of our winters. Not grim, no, I won't burden you with horror, but true, quietly true. The sort of truth peasants lived with the same way we lived with the wind and snow, not fearing it, just understanding it. You see, when winter settles deep, truly deep, past the midpoint of the season, the world changes. Storms return with a vengeance, the air sharpens like broken glass, and sickness stirs in hearth-warmed houses where too many breaths mingle in too little space. These weeks, these longest nights, test us in ways the early winter never does. Let me tell you about the storms first. You from your time know storms as inconveniences, wet shoes, delayed plans, perhaps a night indoors, but for us, a storm in midwinter was a thing of enormity, a force so great that even the bravest farmer would latch his door with shaking hands. When the wind turned wild, it didn't blow, it screamed. It clawed at the shutters like some furious spirit denied entry. Snow didn't fall, it attacked sideways, slashing through every gap, every crack, stealing heat from your bones before it even touched your skin. Inside the house, we'd huddle together. Children in the centre, adults around them, the fire fed constantly, even greedily. A storm was no time to be stingy with wood. If the flames died down too far, the cold crept in almost instantly, curling around our legs, tapping at our knees like an uninvited guest. But the worst part wasn't always the cold. No, the worst part was waiting, sitting there in the dim light, listening to the roof timbers moan under the weight of a heavy snow, listening to the wind batter the walls again and again, like waves crashing against a ship far out at sea. Every crack in the wood sounded like disaster. Every shifting tile made your breath catch. And sometimes, though we tried not to speak of it, the thought would slip in, will the roof hold? Most times it did. Some winters it didn't. But when it did hold, when the storm finally passed and the world fell into that strange bright silence of fresh snow, oh friend, that moment felt like waking into life again. Now storms were one kind of enemy, loud, violent, visible. Sickness was the other, invisible, patient, quiet. When so many bodies share one room, when the air is thick and warm and unchanging, sickness spreads like a whispered secret. A cough in the evening becomes 2 in the morning. A sniffle from a child becomes a fever by nightfall. And we peasants, we had herbs and broths, prayers and charms, but little else. We fought sickness the only way we knew, slowly, stubbornly, with blankets and boiled water and hope. My grandmother used to say winter tests the blood. I didn't fully understand as a boy, but I do now. Winter weakens the hungry, weakens the tired, weakens the old. And so we learned to be gentle with one another when illness struck. If a neighbour fell ill, we brought them broth. If a family needed help, we shovelled paths to their door. Even the poorest household saved a corner of their cupboard for someone worse off. That's how we lived. Not because we were saints, but because we knew what waited if we did not stand together. There was one winter. I remember it clearly, when sickness ran through our village like a shadow. It started with the children, as it often does. The little ones coughing through the night, their cheeks flushed, their eyes dull. My mother brewed endless herbal teas. She knew which plants soothed fever, which eased breathing, and which only tasted bad but gave comfort through the warmth alone. My brother became so weak one night that the whole house sat silent, listening to his breaths, counting them really, as though they might stop if we didn't keep track. But he lived. He grew stronger, one breath at a time. That is how survival works in winter, friend. Not in great leaps, in small breaths. And yet, winter was not only hardship. Ironically, some of the longest nights were also the gentlest. Nights where the moon glowed silver on untouched snow, making the whole village shimmer like a dream. Nights where our work was done early, the animals fed and quiet, the fire warm, the air inside calm. Those nights, we'd sit together and make our own warmth, not with blankets or wood, but with stories. Aye, stories, much like the one I'm telling you now. My grandfather would speak of winters past, winters colder, harsher, longer than anything we'd known. He'd exaggerate, of course, as old men do, claim the snow once reached the roof, claim a frost so sharp it split stones, claim a winter so dark the sun forgot its way north. We children believed every word, wide-eyed, huddled close. My mother would hum songs, slow, soft things, melodies older than memory. Songs meant not to entertain but to soothe, to remind us that winter ends, always ends, no matter how long it seems. My father, practical man that he was, would repair tools by the firelight. He'd sharpen blades, mend harness straps, patch worn gloves. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, yet somehow his quiet work brought us peace. It told us, life goes on, even now. And I would sit there, half dozing, letting the warmth seep into my bones, letting the voices blend into a comforting hum. On those nights, winter felt almost kind, almost gentle, almost like a reason to gather close. If you ask me what truly helped us survive the hardest part of winter, I'll tell you this. Hope is a fire of its own, and shared hope burns brightest. Even when storms raged, even when sickness prowled the village, even when the cold made our breath tremble. As long as we had each other, winter could not break us completely. And now, as the firelight dances across your face and the night grows softer around us, I think you understand. Not just with your mind, but with that quiet place inside a person that recognises truth when it hears it. If you're ready for the next part, say daily, and I'll begin part 9, another 1,000 plus words, where I'll tell you how we celebrated small joys, found comfort in simple things, and looked toward the coming of spring with hearts ready to hope again. Ah, good. I hoped you'd say that. Part 9 is a gentler one, like stepping from a biting wind into a room where the fire is warm, the air thick with the smell of bread, and everyone's shoulders finally relax. Winter wasn't only hardship, friend. It surprised you with small joys, the kind so quiet and humble that you might miss them if you weren't paying attention. But for us, these little moments were the difference between enduring winter and surviving it with our hearts still intact. You see, when life is hard, joy doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It comes in the tiniest ways. A warm bowl, a shared laugh, a story whispered in the dark. Winter taught us to notice these things, to treasure them. Let me tell you about the first kind of joy, warmth. Not just heat, warmth. There's a difference. Heat is fire at your feet. Warmth is fire in your chest. On the coldest days, when the frost painted white feathers across the window boards and our breath hung in the air like ghosts, we'd gather close around the hearth. The fire was our guardian spirit. We treated it gently, fed it carefully, and thanked it silently. You might laugh at the idea of thanking fire, but when something stands between you and the cold that waits to kill you, gratitude comes naturally. Sometimes I remember waking before anyone else, the sky outside still black, the embers glowing soft and red. I'd crouch beside them, breathe gently to wake the flame, coaxing it like a sleepy animal. Raw sticks crackling, the first little sparks leaping up, that sound. Ah, that sound brought a comfort nothing else could. The promise that the day would begin not with shivering, but with light. The second joy of winter was food, not feasts, mind you. We rarely had feasts in the dead of winter, but simple food tasted richer when the world was frozen. A crust of bread toasted on the hearth, a pot of turnip stew bubbling slowly, filling the room with earthy warmth, a small handful of berries we'd dried back in summer. Even a cup of hot water with herbs, bitter though it was, felt like a gift. It's strange, isn't it? The less we had, the more precious each bite became. Hunger sharpens gratitude like nothing else. And then, of course, there were the long nights. The ones that lasted so long it felt like someone had stolen a piece of the sun and forgotten to return it. Those nights brought challenges, yes, but they also brought something we seldom got in the busy months of sowing and harvest. Time. Time to speak. Time to rest. Time to sit with those we loved and actually see them. By day, Peasants worked themselves near to breaking, but in winter's deep dark, work slowed. There was still plenty to do, mind you. Animals to feed, tools to mend, wool to spin, but the frantic rhythm of summer was gone. So what did we do with long, slow nights? We talked. My father wasn't a talkative man in summer, too tired most days, but winter softened his edges. He'd tell stories from when he was a boy, stories he'd heard from his own father, stories probably half true and half nonsense. Tales of wolves the size of horses, rivers that froze so hard you could strike sparks from them, ghosts wandering the edges of frozen fields. We children would sit wide-eyed, pretending not to be scared, though of course we were. My mother told gentler stories, stories about saints and wanderers, lost travellers helped by kind peasants, poor men who shared their last loaf only to discover the beggar was an angel in disguise. Stories that reminded us why kindness mattered, even when kindness felt like a luxury. Sometimes neighbours came over, stomping snow from their boots, carrying firewood or a small bundle of dried fruit to share. We'd make room for them by the hearth, and suddenly the room felt warmer, even if the fire hadn't grown. That's the magic of company. Warmth shared is warmth multiplied. Ah, and then there was music. Not instruments always, though sometimes someone had a flute, and on rare nights a travelling fiddler passed through the village. But mostly it was humming, voices weaving simple melodies in low tones, soft enough not to wake the children. Winter songs weren't lively things. No, they were slow and steady, built to match the rhythm of the fire crackling and the wind sighing against the walls. The third joy of winter, one you might not expect, was work done slowly. In summer, everything rushed. You planted before the rain came. You harvested before the sun burned the crops dry. You ran from field to field like a leaf blown by wind. But winter let us breathe. On winter days, my mother would sit by the window patching woolen cloaks with careful stitches, the needle glinting in the faint daylight. My sister would spin wool into yarn, her spindle whirring softly, a little rhythm that soothed the room. My father carved wooden handles for tools, smoothing them with quiet patience. Even children had winter crafts. We twisted straw into dolls, carved sticks into little animals, learned to braid rope, anything to keep our fingers busy and our minds calm. These small tasks knit the days together, turning the endless stretch of winter into something manageable, something human. But the greatest joy of winter, the one that kept us going when the cold bit hard, was anticipation, hope, the promise of spring. Even at the darkest point of the year, when daylight barely stayed long enough to finish the morning chores, we knew, we believed, that spring would come again, always, no matter how cold the winter, no matter how deep the snow. When the first day began to feel slightly, even just slightly, longer than the one before, we noticed. You modern folk have clocks and calendars. We use shadows, the angle of sunlight on the floor, the way the morning wind felt, the sound of water dripping from the roof as ice loosened its grip. Little signs, barely more than whispers, but to us they were miracles. The first melt of ice on the bucket beside the door, the first crow calling before dawn, the first patch of earth showing through the snow, the first time you could stand outside for a few breaths without your eyelashes freezing together. Hope grew in tiny steps, the same way winter had come, slowly, steadily. And because hope returned slowly, it stayed with us. It filled our spirits gradually, warming us from the inside long before the air warmed from the outside. We peasants were no strangers to hardship, but we understood something you modern folk sometimes forget. Joy doesn't come from abundance. Joy comes from noticing what little you have, and seeing that it is enough. Now the fire here is soft, low, glowing like the coals of memory itself. A good place to pause. Ah, here we are, friend. The final stretch. The part where winter, though still stubborn, begins to loosen its grip. Even the coldest nights, the deepest snows, the longest hours by firelight start to feel less cruel. I want you to feel the shift with me, the slow, careful breathing of a world turning toward life again. By the time the last weeks of winter arrive, most of the village has settled into a rhythm. We know our chores so well they're almost automatic. Feed the animals, check the water, tend the fire, mend tools, spin wool, repair clothing, sweep the floor. Each task takes a little longer in the dark and cold, but it also carries a quiet satisfaction. There is accomplishment in survival. There is joy in routine. And yes, there is hope. The days begin to stretch, though it is barely noticeable at first. Perhaps a few minutes more of light at midday. Perhaps the sun peeking from behind clouds with a softer glow. Those minutes feel like gifts, tiny rewards for enduring the long darkness. Every morning, as the light lengthens imperceptibly, we notice the subtle changes. Snow melts in small patches, the air smells sharper, the ice on the river begins to thin. It is almost magical, almost imperceptible, but it lifts the spirit more than any hearty meal could. During this last stretch, we start preparing for spring. There is a nervous energy in the village, a mix of relief and anticipation. We check the seed stores, polish our tools, mend the last winter tears in clothing and blankets. Some villagers even start digging the first tiny trenches in the frozen soil, imagining the green shoots that will soon rise. It is slow work, careful work, done with hands still stiff from cold, but with hearts lighter than in midwinter. And still, the nights remain long enough to remind us of what we've endured. Sometimes, when the wind still howls and frost bites our toes, we remember the darkest weeks of the season, the hungry evenings, the storms that tore at the roof, the illness that crept silently through homes. But these memories are tempered now with gratitude. We survived. Our animals survived. Our families survived. And that survival has forged bonds deeper than summer days could ever create. Evenings in this final stretch are special. There is more time for storytelling, for laughter, for quiet music by the fire. The children grow more restless, their energy returning with the lengthening days. They run about the house, chasing each other around tables and benches, and for the first time in months the adults smile without restraint at their antics. A few villagers start sneaking outside to feel the bare earth beneath their boots, tasting the air that hints of thaw. It is tentative, careful, like a person learning to walk again after a long illness, but it is full of promise. Meals begin to change subtly too. While winter still demands root vegetables, preserved meats and dried grains, we begin to see the first shoots of spring in our foraged greens. Snowdrops and wild garlic push through the melting snow, tiny harbingers of what is to come. Even a handful of fresh greens, bitter and sharp as they are, feels like a feast after months of stored food. Every bite is a reminder that life continues, that the cycle endures, that the long nights are giving way to light. The barn too shows signs of change. The animals sense it before we do. Cows are more lively, sheep bleat with curiosity instead of fear, pigs grunt with anticipation of foraging soon in thawed pastures. Even the cats become bolder, venturing a little further from the hearth. As we walk among them, checking hooves and straw, we feel a subtle lift in the air. Not warmth yet, not fully, but an ease, a lightness, a quiet announcement that the world is turning again. And yet, even in these moments of relief, winter's lessons remain. We remember how fragile life is, how easily a cold night, a frozen stream, or a sudden storm can change everything. We remember the hard work, the courage, the patience. We remember the moments of fear and how small acts of kindness, attention and care carried us through. Spring does not erase winter, it honours it. And so, we honour it by carrying its lessons forward, taking the endurance, the resourcefulness, the quiet strength, and letting it guide the new season. Finally, the first true signs of spring arrive. The sun lingers longer, melting the snowbanks into muddy streams. Birds return, singing in sharp, joyful notes that echo through the village. Buds swell on the trees and the air tastes sweet, though damp with thawing soil. We step outside more boldly now, boots squelching in melting snow, hands ungloved, faces bare to the air that is still chilly but no longer cruel. Children play freely, shouting, chasing birds, discovering puddles. The barn smells of fresh hay instead of frost. The animals stretch and roll in the sun as if awakening from a long dream. In these moments, friend, we understand why winter is endured. For without the hardship, the fear, the long nights and cold hands and quiet courage, spring would not feel so miraculous. Every small joy of thaw, every patch of green, every soft chirp of returning birds is amplified because we remember what came before. Winter teaches appreciation in ways only true struggle can. And so, as I sit by my fire now, telling you this tale, I hope you feel it too. The cold nights, the long hours by ember and candle, the warmth shared among family and animals, the patience learned in silence. These are the treasures of a medieval winter. And when spring finally arrives, it is not only a season of light and warmth, it is a celebration of endurance, of love, of hope, of life itself. Friend, now you know, we peasants survived winters not because we were strong or clever, but because we noticed the small joys, nurtured one another, respected the lessons of cold and night, and never lost hope that the sun would return. So, when you lie down to rest tonight, think of our fires glowing, our animals huddled, our hearts warm despite the frost outside. Think of the long nights and the quiet courage that carried us through. And know that, even in the darkest winter, there is always the promise of spring. Ah, now the fire is low, the night still. Rest your mind, breathe slowly, and let the story settle like the first soft snow of the season.